Over the past decade and a half, novelist Colson Whitehead has taken on a remarkable range of topics with acclaimed literary finesse. His latest book, The Underground Railroad, continues that accomplished and eclectic journey by reimagining the vast network that helped American slaves flee to freedom as a real railroad. Colson Whitehead joins us now, and it's great to meet you.
No, thanks for having me.
As we suggested, you've written about some pretty unusual topics along the way: zombies, elevator inspectors, coming of age in Long Island. What drew you to this?
Well, it's an idea I had 16 years ago. I came across a reference to the Underground Railroad and remembered how in fourth grade, when I first heard about it from my teacher, the word is so evocative, I imagined a literal subway beneath the earth. It's pretty impractical, obviously, but it seemed that'd be a funny premise for a novel. What if it was actually real and slaves used it? So I had it in the back of my head, and finally, about 2.5 years ago, I felt confident enough to take it on.
Why the need to let it percolate for a decade and a half in your head?
I was, 30, and I was writing books that, I think serious books, but also I had some growing up to do, and I think the ideas felt great and important, and I felt if I wrote more books and maybe kind of grew up a little, I'd be able to do it justice. But I definitely didn't feel I was able to tackle it in terms of craft, and then doing that research into slavery is very daunting. It's very harrowing, and I didn't feel up to it back then.
I have read that you felt scared to approach this topic. Is that accurate?
Well, yeah, to do justice. My family, I can trace my family line maybe 100 years, and then it disappears into the maw of slavery. Did my ancestors die in Georgia, Florida? What kind of farmer plantation did they work on? And so being able to testify for them and the other slaves in their various different places felt like a duty, and taking it on was very daunting.
I'm going to read an excerpt from the book here about which starts by talking about your main character, Ajari. So here's how it goes. Sheldon, if you would, let's bring this up. Ajari bore 5 children by those men, each delivered in the same spot on the planks of the cabin, which she pointed to when they misstepped. That's where you came from, and where I'll put you back if you don't listen. Teach them to obey her, and maybe they'll obey all the masters to come, and they will survive. 2 died miserably of fever. 1 boy cut his foot while playing on a rusted plow, which poisoned his blood. Her youngest never woke up after a boss hit him in the head with a wooden block. One after another. At least they were never sold off, an older woman told Ajari. Which was true. Back then, Randall rarely sold the little ones. You knew where and how your children would die. Colson, that's page 8 of the book.
Sure.
My point is, you get into it pretty hard and pretty fast, and I want to know why.
No, well, I mean, I play with, the second element about the book, apart from having a literal railroad, is that every state that Cora goes to as she travels north is a different state of American possibility, an alternative history, like in, say, Gulliver's Travels.
Cora is the granddaughter of
Ajari. And so before I start deforming reality, I wanted to play it straight, again, to sort of pay tribute to the slaves who actually went through it. I described it as being harrowing doing the research, but obviously it's a shadow of what people actually went through it and endured. And so I wanted to get, so for the first section is a straight historical novel, and I wanted to get it right. And so that section with Ajari is an overture of a typical slave's life. She's kidnapped from Africa and then comes to Randall Plantation, and it becomes a way of getting a typical slave's experience before we get into Cora's journey.
How far afield did you travel in order to do your research?
I'm sort of a homebody, I'm ashamed to say. Luckily for me, all the stuff I use is in the public domain, basically. The slave narratives from 150 years ago. And then in the 1930s, the US government, to put writers back to work during the Depression, hired writers to interview former slaves, people who were kids or teenagers at the time of the Civil War. And so they collected hundreds and hundreds of oral testimonies. Some are 2 paragraphs long, some are 10 pages, some are about farming, some are about master-slave relationships. And so it's all digitized and downloadable. I've been asked, for magazines, like, do you have any research we can photograph for our piece? And it's like, here's my iPad.
It's all there, man.
Sorry. But it also meant that it's just all that history is accessible now.
I don't want to give away too much of the story here, but let's just sort of touch on a few things. Cora, she finally leaves the plantation. What spurs that on?
conditions deteriorate. One of the inspirations for her story was a woman named Harriet Jacobs, who wrote a famous slave narrative, and she escaped from her master, hid in an attic for 7 years, until she could get passage out of North Carolina. So she was my inspiration for having a female protagonist. And then she writes about how when a slave girl hits puberty, that's when everything changes. You're suddenly subject to your master's sexual desires. You're supposed to have kids so that your owner can have more hands to pick more cotton. More cotton is more money. So when she becomes a young woman, things on the plantation become untenable. And another slave, who's a new transplant named Caesar, has contacts on the railroad, and they light off together.
What's the first place she escapes to?
So she goes to South Carolina, and here's our first sort of switching of reality. South Carolina has a scheme of racial uplift, and so they'll buy slaves from masters, give them jobs, housing, and education, and hopefully a new start where they can be woven into the American fabric. And there I'm sort of playing with 1960s social programs, Great Society, to see what kind of tension I can get between slavery and historical events in the 60s, 1960s. And that's when I start playing with reality to put these different historical events in conversation with each other.
And then comes North Carolina?
North Carolina
where blacks are outlawed in your story?
It's a white supremacist state. And so there I can enlarge the conversation to talk about Nazi Germany. The language of white supremacy in 1850 in America is the same as in Nazi Germany. And so by playing with the reality, I get to expand how we think about oppression, find linkages between the oppression of black people, Jews, and then, it's election year, and there's been a lot of sort of hateful rhetoric in the States about Mexicans and Muslims, and definitely a lot of misogynistic rhetoric. So how can I find the linkages between black oppression and all types of oppression? By not sticking to the historical record, I'm allowed to move things around and get that kind of friction.
Do you know where that notion of which you can obviously do in a novel that you can't do in nonfiction, where did that notion of kind of playing around with reality, how did that come to you?
Well, for me, I grew up wanting to write because of Marvel Comics in the late 70s and Stephen King. So my first acquaintance with literature is horror and science fiction. I was like a shut-in watching The Twilight Zone. And so before I was introduced to James Joyce and Hemingway and Ralph Ellison, my idols were Arthur C. Clarke and Rod Serling and Stephen King. So fantasy is just a tool. I've written books that are realistic, books that are more overtly fantastic. I think you find the right tool for the job, and by not sticking to the facts, I was able to get to a larger American truth.
So from the get-go, in your head, this was always going to be historical fiction?
Taking off from historical fiction. Obviously, if you have an Underground Railroad, you're altering things. But luckily, I'm not in a historical novelist union. I'll get kicked out for breaking the rules.
Your membership card is not expired
exactly,
or been ripped up. Did using that style somehow make it easier to tackle such a complex problem like race relations?
Well, I don't have to stick to how things actually happened. And so some people aren't aware of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment where doctors experimented on African Americans. I'm allowed to move these different things around and make us think about them in a different way, hopefully. And so that play allows me a lot more latitude to spark people's different ideas in people's heads.
We quoted something from very early in the book before. Let's try another quote now, this one closer to the end. Here we go. Color must suffice. It has brought us to this night, this discussion, and it will take us into the future. All I truly know is that we rise and fall as one colored family living next door to one white family. We may not know the way through the forest, but we can pick each other up when we fall, and we will arrive together. That's a beautiful passage and very hopeful sounding. How much of what your mission for this book truly is wrapped up in trying to get us all just to get along better?
No, that's not my mission. People asked, about some people see the book as hopeful, some people not so hopeful, and people have asked, like, I mean, it's crazy, but what's your solution to the race problem? And I'm like, I'm not in the solutions business. I write novels, so I don't know. I write books to figure out things about myself, and other books about the world. And I think if you do it right, if you pick the right characters and situations and sentences, other people can come along for the ride. So in writing the book, I have a different acquaintance with American history now. And if other people can see things differently by the way I juxtapose different elements, I think that's swell. And hopefully you're not bored. So people come to books for different reasons. And I think if you're not bored and also think about history and race in a different way, I think that's a fine goal for a book.
I'm just feeling chippy enough not to let you get away with that answer, because I can't imagine you writing this book with as much, brains and sensitivity as you did without assuming there's a bigger mission at play here beyond just the entertainment of the reader. You want to solve the race crisis in society, do you not?
Well, the sad thing is, I've written 8 books, and sometimes people like them, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you get good reviews, and sometimes bad reviews. And so, just as a matter of survival, I don't think about what happens after I hand it in. I hope my editor likes it, and my agent likes it. But you never know. I mean, the reception of this book has been great, and in doing readings, people have been moved by Cora's story, and it is, sort of sparking a conversation in ways I didn't envision, and it's great.
Yeah,
I feel very fortunate. So.
I'm interrupting you because I'm showing this. Can you zoom in on the sticker here? That's what you get when the lady likes your book. Do you get to meet her?
I did meet her. I flew out to her compound in Santa Barbara, and we did a brief interview. And of course, it was a cloudy day, and then the sun came out, and a white dove flew on my shoulder.
None of this happened. None of that happened.
But I met her, and obviously she's such an icon. Ever since I was in high school, she's been such a huge presence, and so it is surreal. And then people trust her word, and so I had such a different audience with this book.
What happens when Oprah puts her book club sticker on your work?
Well, I have books that sound very odd in a 2-sentence description, and people might walk past them. When Oprah says pick it up, they do, strangely. And so it's a much bigger audience, and it's led to a lot of word of mouth. And so in the months since it's come out, it's had a different life than I've experienced with other books.
You were a little more forward than that before we started talking here. Before we went on camera, you said, it's changed my life.
It has changed
my
life.
How so?
Yes. Well, I started as a freelance journalist, and I've always juggled paying gigs with writing, and back then I would write an article, and that would buy me like 3 days of book time. And now a semester of teaching buys me like a month of book time. And so now, with the success of the book, I can just live off the writing for a while and plan my next book without switching back and forth between teaching and writing. And for me, someone who needs like a big block of time to work, that's a big sort of gift. So thanks, Oprah.
Let's finish on this. I know you suggested earlier that once you're finished with the book, in it goes to the publisher and the editor, and you just cross your fingers that everybody likes it. But I'm going to assume that you have higher hopes for this book in particular. What would they be?
Well, I think really, with all books, with all of them, I always take a long view, but hopefully, 10 years from now, people can come to it and enjoy it. And 20 years from now, I always hope that the books last and that, I'm doing something that's not tied to 2016. And, there's a conversation about Black Lives Matter now, and has the conversation about police brutality influenced the writing of the book? And no. But hopefully, 10, 20 years from now, people will pick it up and enjoy it and find it worthwhile.
There's no reason they won't, because it's a timeless story. It's a New York Times bestseller. It's Oprah's 2016 selection for the book club. And it's about the Underground Railroad, which a lot of people in this province know, some of which ended up here. So it's a delight to have you on the program today. Thanks so much.
No, it was a lot of fun.
Colson Whitehead, The Underground Railroad.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.